Merry Christmas, everybody, and I just want to say Paddy Pimblett has teased his return fight against Michael Chandler for UFC London. Now, we obviously know Paddy Pimblett will be fighting in March, April or May. However, we've been yet to find out the opponent, and for the past few weeks, everyone's been speculating who he's going to fight. Over on TikTok, I did a wee TikTok, and I was talking to everyone about. We know it's someone in the top 8 of the division. I don't think it's going to be Gamrot. I think the UFC want to give him a big name who is beatable. Obviously, that's how you build a star and that's how you create hype. But it's also how you create people questioning Paddy Pimblett. Oh, they're feeding him this, they're feeding him that. So when he goes and beats a really top caliber guy, then there's even more hype behind him. I mean, I always bring it back to, and I always compare it to Sean O'Malley. That's the exact recipe they did with him, and it worked out perfectly. He became champ. Obviously, he's no longer the champion. However, we've seen this method work. We've seen this style of promotion and this path to the title before, you know. So, for example, if Paddy Pimblett was to fight Renato Moicano, which we know he's not, if he was to fight him, it's completely justified giving him someone at the top of the division. And people are saying, why is Paddy Pimblett getting someone in the top 8? Beneil Dariush got Dustin Poirier, who was number 2 in the division, and no one had a problem with that, you know. So it's just, these things happen. You put the big names up, you put the big fan bases up there, and you see what happens, you see what the outcome is. And obviously Paddy Pimblett released a vlog on his YouTube channel saying, "I'll see you at the top," which is essentially Michael Chandler's slogan. That's his thing. That's what Michael Chandler says all the time. He says, "Son, I'll see you at the top." That's his shtick, you know. So I feel as if they've both what I think's happened is the UFC has approached Michael Chandler and Paddy Pimblett and said, look, winner of this fight gets a top 5 contender, realistically top 3. Are you both agreeing to this? April pay-per-view, Vegas, something like this, or UFC London. That might be a bit soon for Chandler though. I know he was very injured after the Oliveira fight. He took a lot of damage. It was not a good performance or a good look for him. I didn't want Michael Chandler to get another big named fight. However, Paddy Pimblett, maybe skill level wise, is the perfect test for both guys and to see where both guys are at. Because if Michael Chandler loses this, realistically, what's next for him in the UFC? He becomes a gatekeeper, and Paddy Pimblett goes to the moon, essentially, star power wise. That's how this would go down. But look, I realistically think the UFC's approached both guys and said, winner gets a top 3 fight. Are you ready for March, April, or May? They've both said, come back, yep, I'd be ready, get me a date, get me a contract. That's, I think, what's gone down, and the UFC haven't announced it yet. They'll probably announce it either in January or in the coming weeks, because if Paddy Pimblett's teasing it and both guys have agreed, it will genuinely just come down to the stipulations of when and where, and if both guys are capable. We know Paddy Pimblett's ready to go. He's been prepping for March. However, I think this fight might happen in April. I think 4 months' time, probably perfect for Michael Chandler. 16 weeks till fight night, till he gets another fight under his belt. If you've seen him on that podcast 2 days after the Oliveira fight, you know, he was peeing blood for days, and you know, battered, bruised, very injured. So he said it was the most sore he's ever been in after a fight, and I think that's just because, first of all, he's aging. He hadn't been in a fight in 2.5 years. Now, your body does this thing. It's the reptilian part of the brain where Justin Gaethje's spoken about it before. When you're active and when you're actively in wars, it can do one of two things. It can harden your body up and get it conditioned. So when you're in that thing, your body essentially puts up its defense mechanism and is like, right, we've got to be gritty here. We've got to be tough. But Michael Chandler genuinely looked like he shit the bed against Charles Oliveira. I've spoken about the fight before. He looked absolutely... It's the worst Michael Chandler I've ever seen in my life. A timid and scared Michael Chandler is what it was. And if he goes out there bouncing in front of Paddy Pimblett, I don't think Paddy Pimblett knows how to deal with that. I would love to see Paddy Pimblett get Michael Chandler up against the cage and implement the Oliveira sort of game. Try finish him. I know Paddy Pimblett and Michael Chandler have a really good relationship as well. They both like each other. However, you have to, if the UFC offers you to fight someone, it's not a good idea to be saying no to fighting people in the UFC. You want to be in the UFC's good books. And in terms of who I think will win, if this is the fight to happen, I don't know. However, I would love to see Paddy Pimblett fight Dustin Poirier in Louisiana in April or May. I think that would be the best best fight. And if Dustin Poirier beats Paddy Pimblett, he might have one or two more, because that's a massive name, massive fight. Pimblett versus Poirier, it's a really good selling matchup. You know, the new blood versus the dog who's still there, like Dustin Poirier is. I feel as if Michael Chandler would lose to Paddy Pimblett, and I feel like Dustin Poirier is a much better matchup. So if both guys have agreed verbally but not signed anything, you don't know which way the UFC is going to go. I'd imagine if they do go for Poirier versus Pimblett, if they go for Paddy to fight Dustin, realistically they would have just thrown the names out there to Paddy and Chandler, being like, this is a possibility for this date, would you be up for it? And they both said yes. Maybe it's more of not, maybe it's an open-ended thing. Maybe we don't have a definitive answer, and maybe Paddy and Chandler don't either. However, that's a massive fight at 155, and it's finally getting some new blood into that top end of the division, which we really need, because lightweight's an old division. Lightweight is a really old division. I think Islam Makhachev is 33, 34. Obviously, Armin's getting a title shot. He's 28. That's fantastic. Some younger guys. There's been a lot more younger guys excelling a lot earlier than usual, compared to what we're used to. And I love that. I think it's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to that. But another matchup that's been rumoured and is alleged for UFC 313 is it's Justin Gaethje versus Dan Hooker. That is the fight to make. Winner gets a title elimination bout or a title shot. Realistically, I don't want either of them getting a title shot. They've both had their chance against Islam. Obviously, Justin was dominated by Khabib, got KO'd by Holloway. Yes, he caught Poirier, but I don't really want Justin Gaethje at the top of the division. He's too beatable. He's too old. Realistically, Dan Hooker, I think he's 35. However, he's fun. He's kind of fresh. We haven't really seen much of him in terms of high-profile, top 5 level fight, because he loses. Obviously, the fight with Poirier and Dan Hooker was a classic. It was one of the best fights ever. In terms of who I think would win, I think Dan Hooker absolutely schools him. I think Dan Hooker takes him into the later rounds and stops him. I don't think Gaethje's that good, and you can say, oh, but he caught Poirier, his timing's abysmal. He's extremely slow. His footwork's awful. And he's just not intelligent enough. I think he's too slow. He's not coordinated enough. He doesn't put good combinations together. He kind of just outmans people. Like, he outmanned Fiziev. Fiziev got a little bit tired of beating him up for 2.5 rounds, and then judges obviously gave it to him. I thought Fiziev won that fight, watching it back. However, I'm not too bothered about the decision. I do feel like Justin Gaethje is he's more of a slugger. He's more of a take one to give two type of guy, and also he's not got any power in his hands. In the past 5 years, have we seen him knock anybody out or drop anyone with his hands? Absolutely not. Doesn't happen. I think the perception of Justin Gaethje is completely wrong. I think he's not that powerful. He's not that good. He's not that fast. He's just very difficult to put away and very difficult to deal with when he starts landing his shots. He doesn't have good timing. His leg kicks. He's a very dangerous guy. However, he's not an elite mixed martial artist, and people went crazy at me for saying that on Twitter. However, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he doesn't even belong in the top 5. He's gotten very good, favourable matchups to get him to where he is, and now he's kind of squatting on his ranking. So I think Dan Hooker beats him. I think Dan Hooker's faster. He's more accurate. If you can take a punch, I think Dan Hooker, maybe a left hook, drops Justin Gaethje early and finishes him in the fight. I don't think Dan Hooker gets nearly enough credit. Dan Hooker gets hit far too much though, and he's taken a lot of damage. So it's kind of like, who's going to stick around? That's what this fight is. Who's going to stick around? Who's going to stay at the top of the division? And who's going to go and become a gatekeeper? That's all that fight would be. I think Dan Hooker wins. I think Dan Hooker finishes Justin Gaethje, and I think he does it with relative ease. He will take a few shots, and as long as his eyes don't swell up and some of that scar tissue opens. I also think Dan Hooker, we've seen it against Gamrot, his teep to the body is fantastic, and I would not be surprised if Justin Gaethje finally, for one of the first times in his career, I think he's only made one takedown, would be to try take Dan Hooker to the ground, because Hooker looked good. Against Gamrot, he looked really good. A slightly less active Dan Hooker, a fighting 2 times a year Dan Hooker, who's improving outside of camp, is fantastic. I want to see Dan Hooker in the division. I think he's fun. I really like him. I think he's really funny, got a good personality, and he's an absolute warrior. He's an absolute dog. And first of all, I would like to say, he needs to start moving his head. He needs to start moving his head. He needs to start slipping in and out, landing kicks. It's just not really his style. He's got a few very bad habits. However, I would pick Dan Hooker. I hope that fight maybe February, March time. You know, I think both guys are in the gym. Obviously, Dan Hooker doesn't need 10 to 12 weeks to make 155. I think he's often training. You know, he runs his own gym. He's got his own gym in New Zealand, so obviously he's in amongst it all the time. Probably stays fit, stays in shape. Gaethje's taken a long time off. Last fight was in April. He didn't spar or train for 6 months. He'll be rusty. And also in the back of your mind, God, your last memory of being in the cage was first of all a long time ago, and it was you getting absolutely murked in the KO of the year. So we'll see what happens. I'm very interested, but anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy the little analysis and breakdown of the news that will come out. Obviously, we have Paddy Pimblett and Michael Chandler in the works allegedly, but obviously I would prefer Pimblett to fight Poirier, to be honest, and then I would also like Michael Chandler to fight maybe a Benoit Saint Denis. Benoit doesn't really deserve it, or maybe the loser of Renato Moicano and Beneil Dariush would be a fun one. However, Pimblett versus Poirier is the fight to make, and I would have Dan Hooker battering Justin Gaethje. Hooker's faster. I think he's got a better chin at this point in his career. I think also Dan Hooker wears damage so much better than Justin Gaethje. You can swell up his face and it doesn't change how he fights. I feel like if you break Justin Gaethje's nose, it'll put him on the back foot. You know, if you give Justin Gaethje something to think about, oh my cut, oh my face, oh my eye, it would not nearly affect Dan Hooker as bad as it would Gaethje. Anyway, that's me done. That's me signing off. Obviously, give me your thoughts. Comment the little thoughts you have. You can feel free to message me over on Twitter and Instagram as well. I'm always open to speak about fights. It's what I love to talk about. And yeah, see you later.